I'm Ari Fazeli. I'm the founder of Ketovation and K Nutri, as well as the K Nation Movement podcast. And today I have a very special guest with me, Dr. Ceddia. Why don't you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about how you got started with research and a little bit of your background.
Okay, so I am basically a physiologist, and I have a lab where we study obesity and type 2 diabetes. That's basically the focus of what we study. And we are specifically interested in understanding how the adipose tissue, the fat in our body, affects the way how muscle works, heart, liver, because these are organs that are very important to regulate blood glucose levels. So if we can understand how it works in a normal person, in a normal physiological condition, and then understand what goes wrong when someone has obesity or some other dysfunctional alteration, and then we can try to intervene or come up with more efficient or newer methods to actually treat the dysfunctional alterations that you usually see in people who have obesity and type 2 diabetes. And obesity specifically because we have pretty much an epidemic of obesity nowadays. And there are so many diseases that come along with obesity, because obesity per se, you look and you say, well, it's an increase in body fat. But that brings along with it so many other complications associated with how the heart works, how blood pressure works, or blood glucose level is regulated. So there are so many implications that, and with an impact in health and healthcare in our country, in North America in general, but Canada is especially important. So if we can find new ways and more efficient ways to treat these diseases or the problems that come along with obesity, then I think we can advance and we can contribute to health of the population. So my lab is essentially devoted to studying how the system works under those conditions.
Right. And how did you, rewinding a little bit, how did you get started with research to begin with, back home, and what led you to come here and start your own lab?
Well, my training is in exercise physiology, and I always, from the beginning, when I did my undergrad, I always was fascinated by those courses that I took where they taught us how the human body works, how things function, how you can actually exercise or perform better if you pick a particular type of activity. And then obviously we take a lot of courses, I took at that time a lot of courses that were also associated with diseases and understanding how you can improve the way the system works through exercise. So that kind of, from the beginning, I was fascinated with that. And then I pursued when I finished the undergrad, I did a master's degree in exercise physiology. And then I wanted to do more molecular work. I wanted to know not only the more broader concepts, I wanted to know how the cells, how the intimacy of the tissues, the cells that actually respond to whatever approach you have, be it exercise or diet or whatever. So I wanted to get more into the details of how things work. So I moved to another place where they actually did human physiology, but from a biophysical point of view in biochemistry. So, and it was also an amazing experience because then I had the opportunity to learn things that I didn't learn before. Then I wanted to, but I didn't have that basic knowledge. So I was very, very, it was very good for me because then I had the opportunity to do that. So then it was interesting because at that time I also did and it was, again, I grew up in Brazil and I did all my basic education there. And then when I came to doing a PhD, I did half in Brazil and the other half was in Geneva in Switzerland, and where I did it was study, and half of my experiments or the work that I had to do to write my dissertation I did in Brazil, and the other half in Geneva. And there it was in the medical biochemistry department, where they basically had all these different opportunities, different ways of looking at disease. So that was also a very good thing because I got to learn a lot about the molecular biochemical pathways and things that actually regulate metabolism in our body. So And then once I finished that, I went back to Brazil, and then I wanted to do a postdoc. And then the postdoc was, I applied to several different places, and Canada I'm very grateful for here, because I got actually a scholarship from the Canadian Diabetes Association at that time. It was a grant for me to study diabetes and obesity in the lab here in Canada. So that's when I moved to Canada, and it was 16 years ago now. And that's how I got into this more specifically, in having a lab. And I finished my PhD, my postdoc, and as I finished my postdoc, the opportunity to get a lab and actually continue doing research opened up for me. And that's how I actually end up where I am now.
Right. That's amazing. It's amazing how things open up with enough passion and hard work. And from what I understand, you enjoy training for triathlons. Can you take me through, how you got into that? Because it's an extensive amount of training to, be able to put in on top of, running a lab and being an associate professor at a university. So what led you into doing triathlons, and how do you kind of stay motivated into doing that?
Well, I think exercise was always a major component of everything I did. And in the lab, actually, when we do research, we use exercise as one of the main components that we use for treatment, for instance, or to understand how things can be improved. If you want to treat diabetes, or if you want to prevent, or if you want to treat obesity or prevent, or any of the diseases associated with that, exercise is a major component. So I've been involved with exercise my entire life. I just didn't have the opportunity before of actually dedicating a lot of time to training, because I always wanted to be, I love being an athlete and doing, actually using what I understand, what I learn in the lab, and apply it to myself and also to other people, but in a real life, in an applicable manner. So triathlon was always something that I thought, I think I can do this, because it's fun. You can swim, you bike, you run, you have 3 different disciplines that you have to train for. The issue is, as you said, how do you find the time? So the beauty of being a professor at the university is that we have quite a bit of flexibility in the time. So I have my students in the lab, I have the research, so I have to organize my time to make sure that everything goes well there. So we keep a very tight ship running there. But at the same time, it gives me the flexibility so I can organize my schedule in a way that I can dedicate some time to being. So in 2016, I think I can now the lab is well established, things are going pretty well. I think I can actually get more into being an athlete, or at least try to be an age grouper. I'm not by far not an elite athlete, but also the interesting thing with triathlon is that you have these different age groups, so it can be very competitive, and you can actually enjoy the sport, you can enjoy the activity if you want to be competitive, or if you just want to improve and have fun and enjoy the thing. So for me, it was good because, again, being a professor allowed me to organize my schedule. We have that opportunity to be able to go to the university or do the things that we have to do, and then we can also have some free time. But I have to say, even with that flexibility, I still have to wake up at 5 o'clock almost every day in the morning to swim, because this is another thing. One thing is when you're a swimmer and you're young and you can swim quite well. I'm not at that stage anymore, and I had to, swimming for me is something that I really have to put time. And then, I still have to wake up almost every day at 5 o'clock in the morning, go to the gym or go to the pool and do my 1.5 hours of swimming, and then I go to work, and then I find my way in between.
Right, and that's probably the hardest part, is those early mornings where you get up and your body's just begging you to get another hour of sleep. And my main thing is, how do you stay motivated to get into that training? Because starting that is one thing, but once you run into those hurdles, like you said, you're not the strongest swimmer. So when you get in a pool session, you do an hour or two and things aren't going according to plan, how do you mentally keep yourself going back the next day and the next day?
Mm-hmm. So one thing that I learned, and I think probably is the most important aspect of training, if you want to go anywhere, you have to be consistent. There are different methods of training, there are different approaches that you can do to training, but one thing that is crucial for me, and I always keep that in my mind, is consistency. If you can do things day in, day out, for a long period of time, and keep that consistency, the results come. So sometimes I have those bad days that you go in the pool and you're expecting, oh, I'm going to do a great training session. It's not only in the pool. It's in the pool. It's on the bike. It's running. All this, no matter what, there is always a day that you go there you're expecting to do, or you're even feeling well. But then you start training, nothing happens. It just doesn't, it's not that day. So, but one thing that I always keep in my mind, I need to stick to this. I need to be able to maintain, not get disappointed or not let it dismotivate me, so I can actually continue and do and maintain that training. Because again, if I look in 2016 when I started training more consistently, from now, I mean, the improvement is amazing. What I've seen in terms of improvement is great. So, but it took 3 years for me now. For instance, running is one thing that I always kind of ran reasonably well. But the biggest improvement I had was from, I would say, February this year and up to now. So it's almost 2.5 years of training. Then I noticed it. So one thing is important, and I keep always in the back of my mind, to be able to stay always motivated. Stick to it. You have to do this. Overcome those difficult days, because it will pay off later. And it does.
Right. I couldn't agree more. And I love that you said that, because, our motto is stay focused, be consistent. And I repeat that. It's the background of every single podcast we do. We always come back to it somehow. But being able to stay focused on any goal over a long period of time and staying consistent with it no matter what, I think people need to understand when it comes to exercise or, starting a new sport, the most important thing is just showing up. Even when you mentally you might be discouraged, just showing up and putting in the work, you'll never leave regretting a workout that you had. You only regret the workouts that you don't have. And that, I think, is a really important thing for anyone like you who might be thinking, maybe I can't do this, or maybe it's not going well, is just to show up and put the work.
Yeah. It pays off. And I have to say, and I think you feel the same, because with the CrossFit and the competition that is involved in this, it's not just that you go there and you work out one day and then you work out another day. You have a plan. You have to look, well, how much do I need to improve to be able to be competitive if I want to be competitive? And that also gives us some extra motivation. And every time that you go to a race and you meet all the people that you make friends, and you get to interact with people who also like the same, enjoy the same kind of activity. So that's also another injection of motivation that actually keeps you going and allows you to, even in those hard days. So when you wake up in the morning, 5 o'clock, the alarm clock goes off and you say, I would like to, it would be great to stay a little longer. But actually, if you get up and you go, 10 minutes later, you're great. And then once you're training, you're in the water, or you're running, or whatever you're doing, or if you're doing your CrossFit session, it's amazing, because then you get that feeling, I'm glad that I made this.
That's awesome. Now, going into more of the science side of things, or, like what you look at in your lab. So obesity is a worldwide epidemic. It's unbelievable how much it's grown, and the prevalence of it over the last 30 to 40 years. Just from your background, what do you think is the biggest contributor to this decrease in exercise and this increase in caloric intake that's leading to this? Honestly, it's a global epidemic that's harming a lot of people and leading to more deaths than any other.
Yeah, it's probably the main killer if you were to account for everything that comes along with it. It's a major killer. Yeah. So I think there is a lot of research done on this, and a lot of people interested in understanding how much comes from what components are actually the major ones that determine if you're going to gain weight or not. Right. So now I think we learned a lot. We still don't know everything, but we learned a lot over the, I would say, last 3 or 4 decades studying this. So there is no question. I think this is a consensus that diet is a major determinant. Mm-hmm. It's what we eat. I think it's so easy for people to put on calories or take in calories as opposed to spending calories. We say, we are exercising a lot less than we used to, and we are eating a lot more than we used to, or eating types of foods that have so many calories in it that it really threw the balance that we had before completely off, and then it led us to where we are now. So I think these 2 components are crucial. We need to be able to attack those. But in terms of, I think, for the general population, I think the diet is a major element here. Because as I said, if you do like 1 hour of exercise, or if you put some like 1 hour a day into exercise, let's say you spend 600-700 calories in a relatively not too hard, not too easy section of exercise, you can easily overcome or offset those calories just by eating something that it's just a poor diet. So we need to be able to balance those things, and I think that's the major challenge, because people and a lot of people, they go to the gym and they exercise or they do some kind of physical activity and they say, oh, now I can actually reward myself with foods or things that I could eat just because I exercise. And that is, the balance is not very equal, because you can put so many more calories in through food than you can actually, especially people who are not active, who are not athletes, for them to spend energy, it's not as simple as we would like it to be.
And I think that's a scary part of it, because people are generally misinformed with that. A lot of times people think that cereals and muffins and fruit juices are good for you, but we talked about this with Dr. Connor. You go to the gym for an hour, you burn however many 100 calories, and you come home and you take 4 bites of a muffin. You just put back everything that you did in exactly 1 hour of work and 2 minutes of eating, with physically no reward. Mentally your brain might be satisfied for a maximum of a minute, but then the calories set in and you've just now taken an hour of work and you've thrown out the window for 1 minute of short-term pleasure. So I know it's easier said than done, because people have busy lifestyles and this and that, but I think the opportunity to invest in yourself and your own health is definitely one of the biggest things we have in our control. So with regards to obesity and those factors, what kind of diseases come from obesity? Because we know that obesity is not good for you, and that these can lead to other underlying issues, but I know there's a plethora of things that come from obesity. So can you go into some of those?
I think the 3 most common ones is hypertension, cardiovascular disease. In other words, your heart starts not to work properly. And you also have insulin resistance that can lead to type 2 diabetes. So if you put these 3, only 3, but cancer is another one. You already covered this with Dr. Connor here, I'm sure. But these 3, if you look at diabetes, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, these are by far the main killers that we have in the population. So those 3 are directly related to this. If you can reduce the amount of fat you have in your system, and I've seen cases where people completely get rid of the problems. Hypertension, I've seen people who are obese and hypertensive and they completely cured. Insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, I've seen people that they lose so much weight that they don't even take medication or anything. Blood glucose levels are normalized, totally normalized. So it can be achieved. It is, again, as you said, it's easier sometimes, very often said than done, but it is a way that you can definitely improve the way how the system works. And if we were to get into the specific details about this, is because when the adipose tissue, the fat in our body, enlarges and we have left several cells we call adipocytes that actually store energy in the form of fat. So or those calories that you said, the muffin that you ate, or that extra, that juice that had lots of sugar, or even the fat itself, or whatever you ate in large amounts, the surplus, whatever your body doesn't use to produce energy to maintain your normal functions during the day, the surplus has to go somewhere. Because you just don't poop it out. You can't get rid of it. It has to be processed somehow in your system. So it's going to end up in the fat cell. And it turns out that the bigger your adipose tissue is, or your fat cells become, they become less interested in taking in more. In other words, it's like if you had a bank account that you have so much money in the bank account that you're going to say, I don't want to have any more money. Obviously, we don't do that. Yeah, we don't. Nobody does that. So the analogy, we have to be careful with that, because it's not exactly the way it works in a fat cell. But the fat cell, what it does is that it takes in so much that it gets to a point that the cell is so big that it starts to reject. And the problem is that when it starts to reject, it rejects everything that should be stored there. And then we are talking about fat, but fat can come from sugar, can come from the fat itself. So then it causes what? That backs up, it stays in your blood. So high levels of blood sugar, of sugar in your blood is one of major issues associated with diabetes. I mean, it is diabetes per se, basically. And at the same time, you have fat that should be stored in the adipose tissue, and it's not. So it starts accumulating in different tissues, accumulates in your arteries and clogs the arteries and causes atherosclerosis. And that is another major component that leads to heart attack or may lead to a stroke. And that also because the arteries become now clogged and stiff because the accumulation of fat around the arteries make it stiffer. So blood pressure also goes up. So you see that it's a combination of things that when they are all together, they can lead to very severe complications, health complications, and people die. So this is why if we can reverse this epidemic of obesity, or if we can use approaches by which we can actually minimize or make the fat cells smaller and make them more receptive to put in what you ate. And if that surplus is not too big, it will function properly. So weight loss is a major component of this, because it will shrink the cells, make the cells more receptive for whatever surplus you have in the system. Therefore, it doesn't circulate in the blood as much, and it prevents the negative aspects of the abundance of nutrients that you can have in the circulation.
Right. And it's scary if you look at the statistics, because above drugs and alcohol, obesity-related diseases like heart disease are considered to be the top killers of men, and I believe women are not too far behind in that. And you look at the way they scrutinize cigarettes and alcohol. I'm not saying they're good, but then you have food and the kinds of food that are marketed, and there's no standards, there's no awareness. They're marketed as good food and healthy food, and you would never allow people to do that with cigarettes. But for some reason, these terrible foods that are marketed, especially in grocery stores that are quick and accessible, they can get away with that. So, you talked a little bit about insulin resistance. I think that a lot of people watching or listening might be curious. They hear the word insulin a lot. They hear type 2 diabetes a lot. Can you go into what insulin resistance is, what is insulin, and how this all kind of ties into obesity?
Okay, so it's a very interesting actually mechanism that regulates that, because as I said, there's these fat cells, the muscles, in the liver, they all respond to insulin. What do I mean by that? So insulin is a hormone that is released by your pancreas whenever there is a spike in glucose levels in your blood. So if you have a meal, you sit down for breakfast, for instance, and you eat bread, or you eat pancake and you put syrup or whatever that you eat that has lots of carbohydrate in it, what it does is that it increases the amount of glucose that is available in the system. So that glucose now travels in your blood, goes to the pancreas, and the pancreas senses it and says, well, we need to release insulin. So why is it important to have insulin there? It's because insulin goes to the tissues like the muscle, which is approximately 40% of body weight in a man and 30% of body weight in a woman. So that compartment is very important, because now insulin goes to those tissues and opens the door, because the muscle cannot take in glucose unless you open the door. It's like if you have a door that is selective. It can only be opened if you have the right key. So the right key for that door is insulin. Insulin works pretty much that way. It goes there, opens the door, so now all the glucose that is in the blood can enter the muscle. What's the beauty of it is because the muscle, because it's a large compartment, it can store lots of that glucose, so it takes it away from the circulation. So then you don't have that too much or elevated levels of blood glucose in the muscle, in the blood, because it's stored in different tissues. In the adipose tissue, it's the same thing. Insulin does the same, opens the doors, again puts glucose in, and that glucose ends up as one component of the fat that is stored in there. So again, it's important because it uses that glucose, it stores fat, and then you clear that glucose from the circulation. So this is in a normal functional organism. So that's the way it works, and that's the way we every day, after you have breakfast, after you have lunch, or if you have dinner, or if you have a snack in between, there is always, depending on how much carbohydrate you have on that diet, you're going to have that release of insulin, and the whole process happens over and over and over. So if you have a normal diet, if you eat relatively small portions and it's compatible with how much you need and your body can use that, then everything is cleared up and you're fine. You're not going to gain weight. The problem is that when you have a surplus, you eat way more than you need, which is very easy to do, and people do a lot. Then what happens is you have insulin being released all the time. Not only it stores glycogen in your muscle, but it also stores the surplus in fat. So it's important to know that glucose in the muscle, there is only so much you can store in the muscle, because glucose also, when you store glucose as glycogen, we call, you also bring in water. So there is a certain amount of water that goes into the muscle with that. So because of this relationship with water, we only store a limited amount of glucose in muscles. Now, the adipose tissue takes that glucose and converts into fat. Fat is a different story, because fat now is hydrophobic, so it doesn't need water. It actually doesn't like water. So you can pack up a lot of energy in your adipose tissue without bringing in water. So during the evolutionary period, that's why I think nature selected the fat as our reserve of energy, because then you can pack up a lot of energy there without having anything associated with it. In the muscle, you can put glycogen. In the liver, you can put glycogen, but you have a limited supply, because otherwise it would be so much bigger. It's 1 to 3. What do I mean by this? For one molecule of glucose, you have 3 of water. So if you put 10 grams of glucose in your muscle, you're putting also 30 grams of water associated with that. So there is a limit, because it may be not viable. So, but the fat, no. The fat can do, because it's hydrophobic, it can pack up lots of energy and without taking up as much or bringing in additional components.
Yeah, that's a really good way of explaining it. I think that was really helpful. With insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, I know there are some scary things that can happen. Some people have been known to go blind, amputate their feet. There's some really scary side effects of uncontrolled elevated amounts of blood glucose. Why do you think it is that people aren't generally aware of what could happen, and they still allow themselves to, I guess, eat the way that they do? Maybe they don't know that it could lead to this, or maybe they don't know it's from their diet, essentially.
Well, there is a lot of misinformation. So it's not everyone that really understands. I mean, if you want to sit down and organize your diet, this is one thing that everybody should at some point think of it. But if I do this all the time, every time I prepare a meal, I have to plan ahead of time. And it takes some knowledge of food composition. What is present in that food? What kind of carbohydrates? Because it's not, nowadays we talk about carbohydrate, we talk about fat, but you have different types. You have different ways of combining these things and how they are presented to you in food. So that knowledge of food composition is very poor in the general population. You have to study a lot to do that. So most people don't know. And some people think, because they are drinking juice is good for you because it comes from fruits. But if you go there and you look at the label, read the label, and you see how much sugar you have in that, it's added sugar, it's amazing. But because it's fruit, it's good for me, because fruits are good for you. So I think we lack a lot in knowledge, in basic knowledge, understanding of food composition, because this would be a very important and useful knowledge for people to actually plan their diets and look at what they are eating. So the problem is that you may be eating things that you think are healthy, and I see this all the time. You think it's healthy, but it's not. You only notice it when the problem is already established, but it takes time. You may eat something or you have a habit of eating things that are not healthy, but they don't cause you a problem right away. So the chronic development of a chronic disease takes years, sometimes decades, to manifest. The same thing with heart disease. We see somebody had a heart attack. Why was that? Because there was a clogging of the artery. But that didn't happen the day of their heart attack. It actually happened 2 or 3 decades ago. It started. So it builds up to the point that you have no symptom. So because you don't have any symptom, you may not be aware of it. The same thing with glucose levels. It may be high. Hypertension, your blood pressure may be high, you don't know until you have a stroke. So all those things, they are silent. So they don't really have much of a acute, immediate side effect or negative effect that draws your attention. So that is the problem in the long run, because by the time that you actually realize that you have the problem, it becomes a lot harder to actually reverse it. Associated, basically, again, as you said very well, I think the knowledge that people don't have about what is the appropriate way of eating, or how much exercise they should do, it leads to this kind of situation. And then when you get to that point, it's way, way harder to reverse than actually if you were to prevent it. Right. And insulin resistance, again, as I said, it develops because the cells just can't take anymore. It's too much. You're offering too much. And then you need to actually shrink the system again to be able to improve and make it sensitive again or responsive again, so you can actually function normal.
Right. And most of these disorders, insulin resistance, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, a lot of the obesity related disorders are reversible, like you said, with, good diet and proper exercise. The reason I believe most people don't take those measures is because when they start to feel those symptoms, who do they go see? They go see their doctor. And the first line of defense is a prescription. Take this medicine and take it this many times a day and this many milligrams. And there's zero prescription for diet or exercise. Why do you think we've gotten to this stage where we're able to, take care of our bodies in so many different ways, but the first line of defense is always take this drug, which most of the time has worse side effects than it's initially treating?
Yeah, well, I think it's a very interesting point that you're making, because I always emphasize this. If you go, the doctor, or the way the doctors are trained, they're trained to treat a patient with medication. Yeah. They have very little training in diet or in nutrition. They have very little, if any, training in exercise. So they don't really understand well, but they know quite well what kind of drugs they use. Because when a patient comes to the office, what they do is they do a checkup, or they ask for a few exams here and there. And with those, what they say, well, so you have this and this potential problems, like how do you treat? What are the drugs that I have? What are the options I have of drugs to treat these conditions? And that's what they prescribe. They can't afford. Also, if you put yourself in the place of a doctor, you're in your office, and then the patient comes with a hypertension, with high levels of blood pressure, with type 2 diabetes already in place, atherosclerosis. What you're going to say? Well, we are going to put you on a diet first. We're going to put you to exercise, and we're going to wait like 6 months from now. You come back. We're going to see if you improved. So I don't know if if in reality we could do this. So I understand why they have, we are going to try to fix you as much as we can with these drugs. And the other issue, and I also understand well why the doctors do this, is because people don't stick to the diet and exercise. Again, the story that we were talking in the beginning, consistency. You have to do it on a regular basis. It's a lifestyle modification. It's not something that you do once or twice and that's it. You have to incorporate in your life. So what happens is that you can't afford to wait to see if that patient will actually exercise and do proper diet for long enough to the point that you may reverse all those conditions. They are reversible, and we have a lot of examples. If you look on TV, there are programs where they do like a Biggest Loser and those things. You can see that if you are disciplined, if you're well controlled, you can take someone who is a morbidly obese patient with taking drugs for type 2 diabetes, taking drugs for hypertension, atherosclerosis, everything, and you put that person on a proper diet and exercise program with the motivation required and the control, they lose so much weight. And a lot of them, when we see them, they don't even take medication anymore. But what is the issue here? One thing is you, as a doctor in your office, when you say, look, you have 20 minutes, 15 minutes to diagnose, prescribe a drug, and hope that works and get the patient fixed. Now, if you don't do that, you say, no, we are going to do different. We are going to do an exam, and then we are going to send you out. We are going to give you a prescription of exercise and diet. You're going to try this. See if that works. And then 3-4 months from now, you might even die before you do that. So they can't. So again, it's the story that we were talking in the beginning. How do we go about to do this? We invest a lot on prevention, or we are going to put our emphasis on treating the problem once it is there. If we are going to do this, then it's going to be very expensive, because treating the problem once it's there, it's a lot harder than preventing. Preventing is a lot cheaper, but that's not what the doctor are trained for. Very few are. So it's how you fix the patient right away and send him home. So unfortunately, I think if we work with people in a gym, or like in a setting like you have here, where people come on a regular basis, I think that has a major contribution and impact on people's health. Because if they come and they do on a regular basis, they keep motivated, you prevent. So you have the impact, and it's so much cheaper for healthcare, from a healthcare point of view, to do prevention than it is treating. But again, it's a lot more, I would say, sexy to treat the disease if you know the medication. And there is also a lot of financial interest in this, because the pharmaceutical companies, they develop a drug. How much do they make with that? So Do they really want to? I mean, it's funny when you watch an advertise on TV. They always say, "Oh, take this drug associated with diet and exercise." But really, they don't care about the diet and exercise. They really want to sell the drug.
There's a lot of financial interest, and I think it works in the same way with diet, where back in the day, the American Sugar Association was paying off research labs to publish data that sugar was good for you. And it's a scary, scary thought, because that's kind of where everything stemmed from, right? You had TV commercials and magazine prints and celebrity endorsements that this juice or this cereal or whatever it may have been at the time is the best way to start your day. Your kids should start off this day. And now people are, they're seeing ADHD rates on the rise in young children, type 2 diabetes in kids as young as 6 to 8 years old, which shouldn't happen, right? It should not be happening. And, people are wondering, like, where is it coming from? But it's, the answer is quite simple, but harder, again, to implement and get people aware of. As a researcher, what does the research show with regards to exercise, diabetes, or insulin? How does that all tie in together?
Okay, so the beauty of exercise is that, remember when I mentioned at the beginning that the cells, when they get too big, they don't want to take in much. And also, your pancreas, because there is so much glucose accumulated, there is so much sugar present in the blood because the cells are not taking in, so your pancreas keeps producing insulin. So gets to a point that the pancreas become exhausted because it can't keep up with that stimulus, produce. It doesn't have a rest. It doesn't rest at all. So that can lead to pancreatic complications. The pancreas just fails, cannot continue producing insulin. The beauty of exercise is that exercise stimulates the cells in your muscle because you can mobilize large muscle groups. You can stimulate those muscle cells through contraction to open doors to glucose without depending on insulin. So the beauty of exercise is that it's an insulin-independent mechanism that actually brings glucose inside of the cell. So in other words, you're improving the function of the organ, in this particular case, the muscle, and I always emphasize, again, it's a big compartment in your body. It's 40% in men, 30% in women. So because you have such a large compartment, if those muscles work well, if you can get them to work properly, now you can open doors regardless of insulin. So you don't depend on it, you don't even need insulin, actually. In your body, it's interesting because if you study and we know this from many, many studies that have been done, if you start running, and let's say you're going to run for half an hour, 1 hour, or even longer. If you're running a marathon, your body actually, as you progress with exercise and you continue, it shuts down insulin production. It doesn't want to have insulin released at the same time you're exercising. Why is that? Because if you have insulin and exercise promotes glucose to enter the cells. And if you put insulin, it's going to exacerbate the effect. You might develop hypoglycemia. So your body is designed in a way that when you have that stimulus of exercise, your body actually shuts down insulin production. So with exercise, you don't rely on insulin and you can get all that glucose in. So that's a very important component. And if you look at all the programs that I've seen in hospitals, in any place where they use, where they have like rehab programs or exercise programs to improve or to treat diabetic patients, it's a cornerstone of the process. Exercise, because you can improve the ability of the tissues, the cells, the muscles, your liver, your organs, to utilize glucose, absolutely independent of insulin. And that's the beauty.
Right, and we won't go into too much detail, but there's a really beautiful protein, AMPK, that is actually able to pull in glucose through exercise contractions. And it's really an art form, the way our cells were built. Not just to produce life and help us breathe and produce energy, but to regulate themselves and fix themselves. All you really have to do is just exercise, not even that much. I mean, I when I tell people to exercise, I think even half an hour a day is enough. Just like you said, showing up is the hard part. You don't have to overthink it that I'm overweight, I have insulin resistance, I have to go to the gym and run an hour every day. Well, no, just show up and do 20 minutes, because exertion is relative, right? For someone who's 300 pounds, to go to the gym and to do a moderate pace, elliptical or jog, whatever low resistance might be, like that's a lot of, calorie burn that you're doing. You don't have to put this magnitude on yourself or this pressure that I have to go to the gym and do 2 hours on a bike every day, right? It's the little amounts that help you out and can kind of...
Yeah, you can start with 10, 15 minutes. That is as little as that. And you can build up if you improve, which everybody does. Improvement, it doesn't matter if you're young, old, everybody improves. You may not be, obviously people have different abilities, but everybody improves. Relatively to themselves, they all improve. So 10, 15 minutes of exercise every day, you can get a lot with that. And again, it doesn't have to be aerobic exercise or elliptical or running. You can do weights. You can do a combination of different types of activity. Again, the important thing here is that the muscle contracts. And again, you mentioned a very important point from a molecular, if we were to go into the molecular aspect, this protein that you called AMP, activated protein kinase. It's a complicated name. It's hard for people to actually associate. But in simple terms, it's like if you have a sensor in your cells that sense energy. In other words, if you have high levels of energy, the protein is dormant. But when energy levels tend to reduce because you're consuming energy, such as during exercise, the protein becomes active and tells, hey, we need to bring in more substrate. What is the substrate? Glucose, fat. Let's burn it. So that contraction, muscle contraction, brings that protein from a dormant state, if you will, from a quiescent state, and makes it become active. And the activation of that protein opens those doors that I was telling before, in which glucose now comes in, regardless, again, independently of insulin. So again, it doesn't have to be one particular type of exercise. You can do different things. The most important thing is pick one thing that you like. Pick one thing that you enjoy. Because what's the best type of people say, what's the best type of exercise? The best type of exercise is the one that you do, you enjoy, and you do it regularly. It can be weight training, it can be running, it can be biking, swimming, it can be CrossFit, it can be whatever. Any option that really makes your muscles contract, improve your overall function, it will do well. So, and it doesn't have to be 1 hour, 2 hours. You don't have to be a triathlete to get that benefit. I happen to enjoy it because I like the outdoors and everything that comes along with it. But you can do 10, 15, 20 minutes of exercise and you're going to benefit a lot.
Right. And I couldn't agree more at that point, because anytime, people have struggles getting into a gym, a lot of people don't like going into a gym and just running on a hamster wheel. But I can almost guarantee that there's one activity or sport that they enjoy doing, whether it's from their childhood or at one point they looked at it and they said, I think I could do that. Like I started playing hockey a few years ago, and I'm still not good at it, but I love playing hockey. And I can't run on a treadmill. Like I can't. After 5-6 minutes, I'm just bored. But you put me on a rink, or you put me on a soccer field, which I also like to play, and if there's some aspect that takes my brain out of the exercise component and I don't feel like I'm being forced to do something, it's fun, and you don't think about it. You push your body to its limits and you have fun, and it never feels like work. It never feels like exercise. One last thing that I was hoping you could touch on is processed sugars, like high fructose corn syrup. We've been seeing that more and more, especially in kids' snacks, breakfast, juices, you name it. Can you talk a little bit about the dangers associated with high fructose corn syrup and why it's not just sugar?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a very interesting, again, thing that we learned, and it's, again, man-made. Because you can go and eat a fruit, a raw fruit. If you take like an apple, if you eat an apple, there is fructose there. But this is a relatively small amount. So your body can handle that well. Now, the food industry, what did they say? In the fructose, there is an important thing. Fructose is a simple sugar, like it's very similar to glucose, actually, but there's a slight modification in the molecule that makes it very sweet. So if you want to sweeten anything, fructose is the thing that has the highest sweetening power, obviously from natural things, as opposed, because you can make a synthetic sweetener that is way stronger, more with higher sweetening power than fructose. But fructose has that feature. You find in fruits, as the name says, fructose is the sugar of fruits. But in fruits, in nature, it's in relatively small amounts. So it makes, you eat an apple, it's not extremely sweet. You eat other fruits, they're not, but they have a little bit of fructose there. So what the food industry discovered is, well, what if we actually take this fructose. We separate, we take everything else that when you eat an apple, you're eating everything, fructose, fiber, water, vitamins. This is rich in different nutrients there. Now, the food industry was, okay, how can we make more money out of this? So what they did is we are going to isolate the fructose because it's very sweetening. So we can use that to make foods more palatable, or increase the sweet taste of food with a cheap thing, because you can isolate that. You can make it from corn. That's why they call high fructose corn syrup, because they can extract from corn and then make it in large amounts in a relatively cheap manner, so they can actually sweeten all their products with that thing. So it turns out that we learned that when you break that balance, when you go over what the natural distribution of fructose is in foods, you actually cause a lot of problems, because fructose is in high amounts, which is not what we usually get when you eat a fruit. But in that processed foods, they put large amounts of that fructose. It's sweet, but it also makes your liver to make that fructose into fat. And that's why the liver becomes what we call fatty liver disease, or non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Why is it? Because alcoholics have that problem, because what your body tries to do is, how do you get rid of alcohol? You make it into fat. So, but then if there's another problem, that fat, where does that fat go? It stays in the liver, messes up the liver. So alcoholics have major issues with liver. Now, if you eat too much sugar or too much fructose too, especially this one that it comes from processed foods, what happens is that your liver, in a similar way, tries to get rid or modify that, makes it into fat. Now you develop fatty liver disease, and then your liver doesn't work properly, and it's associated with obesity, insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, all the problems associated with that. So I think the major concern nowadays is, how can we go away from this? We need to go back from the way we used to eat before. We need to eat real food. And when I say real food, is if you're going to eat eat the fruit raw. Don't dehydrate the food. Don't process the food. Don't make just eat raw. Because that is the way how we evolved. Our system, our organisms evolved to process food in the natural manner. How when you eat it in a complex manner, not simplified by extracting one nutrient and think, oh, that nutrient will do a miracle. And it doesn't. Your body works well when it's in a mixture of things, as opposed to being in an isolated form. So fructose is a typical example of that. Trans fat was another one that people, nowadays, it's almost, it should be banned completely from the food, from the diets. I mean, you don't need trans fat, because, again, the food industry modified fat to make it more, to resist more, to make products that will have a longer shelf life, or more palatable. So those things, they end up having a lot of other side effects, a lot of other complications, because you're isolating one nutrient, or you're modifying a nutrient to make it more profitable, but in terms of health, tremendously detrimental.
Right. Okay, that's great. Thank you so much for being on the show and shedding some light onto that research. I think if we could sum things up, if you want to exercise, get out, do what you enjoy, even a little bit at a time. It can help you with basically anything. So thank you for being on the show. If you want to just let everyone know again, if they want to connect with you, say in terms of research, where they can find you or how they can connect with you.
Mm-hmm. So first of all, thanks for having me. It was a great pleasure, and it was a very interesting discussion. I could talk about this forever. I mean, you can see how I enjoy it. So I'm at York University in the Department of Kinesiology. So my lab is again, it's easy to find me. You can go on a website, York website. You can find me on the directory, and I'm more than happy to, if anyone wants to connect or ask questions or know more about this, I'm more than happy to speak to them or exchange emails or whatever it is.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much.
Thanks again for having me.